Panasonic dropped the S5II, a lot of us Sony A7IV users were like, the S5II made a wave when it dropped because a lot of people who used its predecessor, the S1H, said,
I frequently suggested that they were just one good autofocus system away from being essentially perfect cameras.
And that's exactly what Panasonic did in the S5II. New gear can be really exciting when it either adds efficiency or overall quality to your workflows, but it's also easy to get caught up in the hype. Let's see where the S5II lands in all of that. I'm in the middle of deciding if I'm gonna keep my Sony A7 IV or jump ship over to the Panasonic S5II, and you're all coming along with me. I've watched all of the early videos, looked at all the specs, read all the articles about the S5II, and synthesized that information into this video where I'm ultimately gonna be making a decision. Am I keeping my A7 IV? Am I going to the S5II based off of all of the things that I find most important for my style of shooting? If you wanna level up your creative skills, subscribe down below. All the subscribers to this channel are good looking, fantastic people, just like you, and we'd love to have you. Here we go. Pros and cons between the A7 IV versus the S5II, starting out number one with autofocus. The S5II finally has phase detect autofocus, making it a viable autofocus camera. Finally, Panasonic. And the Sony A7 IV crushes it when it comes to autofocus. I've been using this for a while with no concerns about reliability of the autofocus. Caleb over at DSLR Video Shooter did find a bit of a weird pulsing in the autofocus with the S5II. Makes me a little bit concerned about reliability for autofocus. Overall, there's not a lot of people talking about this, so it must be a very, very small hiccup, but it is worth noting nonetheless, and this very well could be solved with a firmware update. Let's talk about color. The first thing is both cameras have 10-bit color, so perfectly even there. V-Log, which is the log profile in the Lumix S5II, has a fantastic reputation, and the overall color science behind Panasonic cameras is also quite strong. Some people think that Sony cameras have a funky color science. I fully disagree with that and think that the updates that they made to their color science, starting with the A7S3 a few years back, and following suit the A7 IV has that same color science, those updates were a huge improvement. It's hard to give either one of the cameras the point here because of how subjective this is. I do think that you can get good looking colors out of any camera if you are accurate with your white balance in camera and have some skill when it comes to color correction in post. The screen. Both cameras have a fully articulating flip out screen, which is fantastic. Screen resolution. The S5II wins here with a 1.84 million dot 3-inch display versus Sony's less than ideal 1.037 million dot 3-inch display. That means that the detail and overall performance of the screen in bright situations of being able to actually see that screen and the details within is almost twice as good on the S5II. Frame rates and resolution. The Sony A7 IV has 4K 24, 4K 30, 4K 60, and in 1080 we have all of those same frame rates. Additionally, we have 120 frames per second, and those are all in 10-bit color. And the S5II has 4K 24, 4K 30, 4K 60, all of those also in 1080. Additionally, in 1080 we get 120 frames per second, and this is one the S5II has that the A7 IV does not have, 1080 and 180 frames per second. Although some of the footage that I saw in 180 frames per second did look a little bit soft, but it is still cool to have that feature. The S5II has a huge win here on the next resolution and frame rate. It has up to 6K, 24p, and 30p in what's called open gate, which allows a lot more flexibility and quality for cropping vertical videos and other formats. This is an amazing feature, but there is a bit of a hang up that I have with it, and we'll get to that in just one second. Let's talk about crop factor. Both of these cameras do suffer from having to crop in on your image in certain frame rates. Both cameras in 4K 24 and 30, there is absolutely no crop at all. But both do have a crop when you want to go to 4K 60 frames a second. We're going to get a 1.5 times crop there. Both cameras do not have a crop in full HD 120 frames a second. What about record limit? Good news here is both cameras do not have a record limit while shooting in 4K 24 or 4K 30 in 10-bit color, which is outstanding because that is the codec that I usually shoot in when I'm doing longer format videos like interviews or tutorials. How do the cameras do with overheating? I don't think it's an issue for either. Some people have said that the Sony A7 IV has had some overheating issues if it's recording for a very long time in hotter temperatures. I have had no issues with it whatsoever. The Panasonic S5II might edge out the Sony A7 IV here in the overheating category. The S5II has this really clever heat sink fan built into the top, so props on that design. What about stabilization? Sony had no chance here. Panasonic does an amazing job with in-camera, in-body stabilization, and the S5II looks amazing. This will come in handy for handheld shots or vlogs. I did notice a bit of a wobble in the back or the foreground of the frame or the edges of the frame in some of the shots that I saw, particularly using a wide-angle lens. A7 IV stabilization, I'd put it in a good, not great category. I use it all the time. I've actually been really happy with it prior to seeing what the S5II is doing. So if the S5II is a 10 out of 10, the A7 IV, I would give it an 8. Rolling shutter, both cameras are very comparable in that they have a similar rolling shutter performance, but unfortunately that performance is really not great for either camera. Memory card slots, both cameras have 2 slots for UHS 2 type memory cards, which is fantastic. The A7 IV does have a leg up here in that it has 1 card slot that you can use a CF Express Type A card in, which is gonna be a big benefit, particularly with high frame rate photo shooting. You're gonna be able to get more frames per second and your buffer is gonna be a lot larger, meaning you can just blast away and you're probably never gonna fill that buffer up. Let's talk about low light. Both cameras have a dual native ISO, which uses an algorithm to emulate dual gain functionality in the camera. This means that there are essentially 2 base ISOs, and that creates an impressive low light performance. From what I've seen, they're very comparable when it comes to low light or overall ISO performance. Photo capabilities. Only thing I really care about here, as everything else is pretty comparable, is the megapixel count. The S5II has a 24.2 megapixel sensor and the Sony A7 IV has a 33 megapixel sensor. A7 IV wins here, and I do like having the 33 megapixels a lot, but I did use an A7 III a long time ago, and that was a 24.2 megapixel camera, and I love that camera and think it had really good character. So I think 24.2 is plenty, but 33 is certainly nice. I'm just gonna call this next section just additional features. Again, the S5II has this open gate video recording function, which allows us to shoot a bigger frame in 6K, so we have a lot more ability to crop. You can shoot a video just like this and crop in on vertical, not have to reframe. On the A7 IV, if you wanna get a good vertical video, you're either gonna have to crop in a ton, zoom the frame in, and probably not have very good composition, or plan on shooting vertical, tilt the camera at 90 degrees, that way you have a vertical shot and you can frame it up accordingly. S5II here wins for sure. But, and this is a big one, the S5II loses autofocus when shooting in 6K open gate when it's connected to an external monitor. This is actually a big downside for me, and I think it's worth noting because it might affect some of you. The S5II does still get autofocus in 4K when connected to an external monitor, but so does the A7 IV. So at that point, they're equal in that I won't be able to fully benefit from that 6K open gate for my style of shooting, being that I'm self-shooting a lot and constantly needing to lean on an external monitor to make sure that my framing's right. So unfortunately, this is a fairly large downside for me when it comes to the S5II, because at first glance, 6K open gate would have been incredible. Shutter angle. The S5II allows us to dial in our shutter angle to be 180 degrees versus the frame rate, which will give us perfect motion blur in our frame. A7 IV, I don't know why Sony hasn't added shutter angle yet, but in the A7 IV, we have our standard shutter speeds to lock off, and they're never gonna be exactly double our frame rate, so the S5II has a nice feature here. The ability to install LUTs in camera and even bake them into the footage is something that the S5II has. It's a fantastic video-focused feature. A7 IV doesn't have this. Exposure tools. The S5II gives us some very, very good exposure tools for video, things like false color, lumiscopes, and spot metering. A7 IV has things like zebras and regular meter mode, which are great, has a histogram as well, they both have that. S5II though, with those additional features, that's a big win. Both cameras have a full-size HDMI port. Hopefully we're just past those years of not having that at this point. White balance lock. I know it's a small feature, but I love this feature. The ability to let the camera get the white balance of the scene using our auto white balance, and then toggling to lock it off and not change it. I use that all of the time. And both cameras have that. Getting into our lens offerings for these cameras, Currently, Sony wins by a long shot. Between Sony's native lenses, through what Sigma offers for Sony, getting into what Tamron offers for Sony, and there's some other ones as well, but those are the big ones, we have a ton of different options. However, that doesn't mean that the S5II doesn't have viable options. We still have a wide angle zoom, we have a 24-70 zoom, whether you want to go through Lumix or go through other parties like Sigma, they have some good offerings there too for the L mount. So not nearly as much as Sony, but because of how popular I think the S5II is going to be, I would expect third-party brands like Sigma to go really hard over the next 12 months, creating a ton of lens for the L mount, and obviously Leica, Lumix, they're all gonna come pretty hard at making a lot of lenses. So right now, yes, Sony wins in lens lineup. I think the S5II has plenty of current offerings, and you're gonna have a lot more coming down the road. Cost, the A7 IV is $500 more than the S5II. Fantastic job by Lumix packaging a ton of features into a crazy value for that camera at $2,000.
So where does that leave us? I guess it's time for a decision. I shoot mostly internet videos, YouTube stuff, some light brand work. From a photography perspective, it's mostly YouTube thumbnails and some fun hobby stuff. That's an important context to understand because my decision is going to be based off of those things, and the things that I highlighted in this video being of the utmost importance for me. And I am going to be holding on to my A7 IV. If the S5II was able to keep autofocus while in 6K open gate and connected to an external monitor, that'd be a big aspect in me jumping over. And if some of the quirky autofocus things were fixed up with a firmware update, things like the pulsing that Caleb saw, or the fact that when you're in 1080, shooting anything over 60 frames a second, you lose human autofocus, which is human face, human eye, human in general. That's kind of a downside. If those things were cleaned up, I'd absolutely consider it. So hey, Panasonic, you make those tweaks, want me to take a look at the camera, you know where to find me. The other additional features like the exposure tools like the false color and spot metering, the fact that you can install LUTs, the insane stabilization, the shutter angle, those are amazing features, but just those alone, I'm not gonna jump over from the A7 IV completely. Now again, if you have those features plus the open gate and some of those autofocus tweaks, it's an easy decision for me to make. I'm not connected to Sony for any other reason than I think it's the best tool for me right now. But if I didn't have either of these cameras and I was just making a decision between the two, I'd go with the S5II. It's gonna be really hard to beat the features and the value that's in there for $2,000. If this video helped you out in making a decision between these two cameras, let me know by giving it a tap on the thumbs up down below. And while you're down there, I'm curious, drop it in the comments, which camera are you going with? Are you an A7 IV user and you're switching over? I'd be very, very curious on that. Not surprised, but I'd be curious as to what made you make that jump. Thanks for clicking on the video. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. See ya.